Hello, my name is Franz Altner. I'm a PhD student at the University of Vienna, and this presentation has received financial support from the ESC. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about corporate activities and actions, and my claim will be that one of the main accounts of group agency, namely this Pettit's account, and related ones, have a problem distinguishing between the two. Now, this problem, I will show this by looking and exploring a counterexample, but more about this later. For now, I want to give a short summary of what I call a proceduralist account of group agency. This is not the name that I came up with, but one that Niels Hahn uses. Proceduralist account of group agencies such as List and Pettit and Stephanie Consuloff with Smithis argue that we can only understand and predict the behavior of organized groups by adopting the intentional stance towards them. Now, adopting the intentional stance towards a system means that we attribute mental states, in the case of groups, to groups, and assume that these mental states satisfy standards of rationality. Now, List and Pettit's kind of novel contribution to the literature was to take the tools developed in social choice theory to identify which group attitudes to attribute to group agents. So group attitudes, they argued, are determined via aggregation functions that take as input manifested individual attitudes and judgments on propositions and output the group's attitudes. Now, aggregation function is the formal term, most of you will know it, but it simply means it simply refers to decision-making procedures such as majority voting, dictatorial systems where a dictator says what a group believes and intends, but also more informal kind of decision-making procedures such as collective deliberation. Now, aggregation functions typically don't take the mental states or the manifested individual attitudes of all the members of a group, but pick out certain individuals to determine the decision of a corporation, for example. And this is done by hierarchies which fix individual attitudes that are relevant for the decision-making procedure. And these hierarchies also determine which set of members is to enact a group decision. Now, List and Pettit's second kind of novel contribution was to show that the rationality assumption that's required for the intentional stance is justified only if the decision-making procedure automatically ensures consistent outputs and other rational requirements, or if a group does this via reasoning. And they famously showed this by looking at discursive dilemmata, where they showed that a majority voting decision-making procedure does not ensure consistent attitudes for propositions that are logically interrelated. Now, this is already all we need to define what it is for a group to act intentionally. A group acts intentionally if the members' actions are controlled by a group intention, which is the direct output of a decision-making procedure that ensures consistency, or formed on the basis of relevant group desires and beliefs that are the result of decision-making procedures themselves. The problem is that this definition gives us the wrong kind of answers for the following kinds of cases. Misappropriation. A restaurant chain, Vienna Schnitzel, staying true to my local university, is listed at the stock exchange and has 3 CEOs, Bob, Sue, and Ann. Bob and Sue are responsible for the day-to-day management, while Ann is concerned with long-term strategic planning. In their position as CEOs, Bob and Sue intend to misappropriate the restaurant's funds by arranging to buy the pork used for the famous schnitzels exclusively from a friend who charges the firm double the market price and transfers some of her profits back to Bob and Sue. Now, is misappropriation an instance of corporate intentional action? Well, first we can note that Sue and Bob's buying the expensive pork is attributable to the corporation, giving the role in the hierarchy and the relevant aggregation mechanism. They are responsible, they have to make decisions on the day-to-day management. Surely buying the kind of pork that is bought falls under their jurisdiction in a certain sense. And when we further assume that the aggregation, that they have to agree on these kinds of bigger contracts, since they both profit from the decision, we can assume that they both agree anonymously. We can also note that the actions are consistent with their other choices on behalf of Vienna Schnitzel. Let's just assume this, which all imply the corporation's demise. So suppose they just use the corporation Vienna Schnitzel to enrich themselves. So they meet rationality standards regarding the coherence of attitudes. Now, according to List and Pettit's framework, we can thus conclude that buying the pork is an intentional action by the restaurant. We can adopt the intentional stance because we have the relevant mental attitudes, and these mental attitudes satisfy standards of rationality. Or so it would seem, where Vienna Schnitzel operating in a legal vacuum, which they are not. We have to make a further assumption, namely that they exist, that they're placed or positioned in the US. So they're selling these Vienna Schnitzel in the US. In the US, there's something like the business judgment rule. It's a legal condition for attributing an activity of a member of the corporation to the corporation. And it's part of the legal framework of how to deal with conflicts of interests. It states, and clearly this is a conflict of interest, they are selling they're buying schnitzels from a friend because they're benefiting from it. Now, the director, not just to quote the business judgment rule, part of it, the director shall perform his or her duties in good faith in a manner he or she reasonably believes to be in the best interests of the corporation, and with such care as an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would use under similar circumstances. Now let's forget, there's a lot to unpack here. Let's not do it all. Let's leave duties, what is meant by duties in good faith aside, and what is meant by care that is kind of done by an ordinary prudent person, and focus on the second condition, namely that the director believes the decision to be in the best interest of the corporation. That Bob and Sue do not have the best interest of the corporation at heart. Now, what is the role of the BGR? Its purpose is to show that actions that fall under the business judgment rule count as actions by the corporation. Contraposing this, corporate law thus deems a self-dealing transaction voidable at the firm's option. So if Anne finds out that that Bob and Sue have this deal going on, she can make the contract voidable. Therefore, we can take misappropriation to be a problem for proceduralist accounts of group agency. First, it shows that some mental states, such as goals that are connected to a corporation's interest in surviving or that are in its general best interests, for example, making profits in order to survive, are externally fixed via the legal framework that a corporation finds itself in. And this much has been shown by, or has been argued by Epstein in his 2015 book, Entrap. Now, certain member actions like self-dealing that are detrimental to the group's best interest, to its survival, maybe even, given this kind of legal framework, do not count as group actions. And the problem is that proceduralist frameworks cannot account for this. As before earlier shown, under List and Pettit, this action is indeed a group action. What I now want to add to the debate is I want to give the proceduralist something to say, although I will finally conclude that there actually is, the only option is to take a kind of metaphysical position that Brian Epstein takes. So, but one of the claims or one of the responses you might get from a proceduralist is to say, that the adoption of the goal self-destruct in order to benefit Bob and Sue is not a goal the corporation can rationally adopt. If it can't rationally adopt it, we can't adopt the intentional stance towards it. And Sue and Bob are not acting intentionally. But the problem here is that, and they will argue, before we come to the problem, they will argue that aiming at satisfying the firm's best interests is a constitutive end of the firm that the members agree to when they brought the firm into existence, and that can't be dropped by any member. Now, what is the source of the necessity involved in this constitutive end? I think there are three options. The first is conceptual. Members have the belief that certain kinds of groups, by definition, must have certain ends. Now, this might be the case, but this seems to be a contingent, just a contingent fact. We might, so maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A, but I don't think, even if there's this conceptual link, there's a huge debate in business ethics, for example, about what kind of ends, constitutive ends, a corporation or even a public corporation should have. People who favor stakeholder management have different constitutive ends in mind than people who believe that a corporation should be shareholder orientated. So I think it's difficult to come up with a conceptual argument for this necessity. Then some people might say that the end of acting in the best interest of the group is practical. Some groups set themselves up, or most groups maybe set themselves up to pursue certain ends and can't in practice change these ends. Now, this might be true for oil companies that are drilling for oil and that have invested all their resources in human and practical tools that are just good at this task and nothing else. But it doesn't seem to apply in a kind of meta end or this kind of end of survival. It seems that this end of survival can always be dropped, like it has been by Sue and Bob in our misappropriation case. Now, I think the third option, the most plausible, is that this constitutive end is fixed by social practices and laws. And because of this, can't be altered by members within the group. Now, if this is the case, then the proceduralists have to drop the assumption that the intentions or the group attitudes and intentional action is just determined by its members' manifested attitudes. And well, I think that's the most plausible response. But it would be problematic for the proceduralist, in that it doesn't seem to be open to the proceduralist to say that. Well, the proceduralist might have another response. They might bite the bullet and say, well, misappropriation is indeed an intentional action by the corporation, even if the law does not recognize it as such. The law is maybe mistaken here. Well, here I think that intuitively, in the case of misappropriation, it's not the corporation that is in control of its beliefs or desires in making the decision, but Sue and Bob are in control and enforce and kind of hijack the collective, the group perspective by substituting their own perspective in that group perspective. And even if it's true, well, if misappropriation is an intentional action, then the group should be held responsible for it. But it seems, and again, should be punished for it in cases where misappropriation leads to problems for other agents that are not the group. But it seems unfair to punish Werner Schnitzel, since already the agent that is harmed by its own supposed action. And well, and this concludes basically my short discussion and objection against procedures accounts of group intentional action. I think that they have to take into account certain mental states that are not dependent on, or that do not supervene on the attitudes of the group members. But if they do this, I think they can solve the problems that are raised for them. If they don't, and if they do bite the bullet, I think that this runs into problem for answers that they want to give regarding responsibility attributions.